Hi, this is Marshall Toplansky.
And Joel Kotkin.
And welcome to the Feudal Future podcast. If you're listening, it means you're interested in creating a better future, one that values diverse discussion and preserves opportunity for the middle and working classes.
This is why we started the show, to bring together ideas and people that challenge the notion of a hierarchical, socially stagnant, and centrally programmed future. Maybe you've experienced the rising costs of home ownership, diminishing job prospects, or the burden of over-regulation and increasingly censorship. This is happening in cities everywhere, and we recognize the need for new action.
For this reason, we created the Beyond Feudalism Facebook group, a place for you to connect and share resources with like-minded people. Here you'll be able to ask questions, network, and share your own stories and ideas on how we can bring opportunity and common sense back into our civil discourse and governance.
Consider this a hub for all things feudal, where we'll be sharing insights from our recent Beyond Feudalism report with Chapman University, clips and highlights from the podcast, and links to related content on topics such as housing, education, energy, transportation, and entrepreneurship. Much of our focus has been so far on California, but we expect to see this work and apply this work to conditions around the world.
Well, as you can probably tell, we're not too excited about the path we're currently on as a society, but we are hopeful for what's possible. And if we can better understand what's happening and build momentum to overcome the trends, so much the better.
So we encourage you to join the Facebook group via the link below to get involved and keep up-to-date information on all new developments. And for more information, my new book, The Coming of Neo-Feudalism, outlines everything that's happening and where we need to change. The link to that is also in the show description.
So thank you very much for tuning in, and we hope you enjoy the show.
A Manhattan with 300,000 less people and half as many tourists might be a great place to live. And by the way, even more attractive to the very well-educated and the well-heeled. This is Joel Kotkin.
And this is Marshall Toplansky.
And you're listening to the Feudal Future podcast. Our society is being rapidly reduced to a feudal state, a process now being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. Millions of small businesses are near extinction. Millions more are losing their jobs, and many others will be stuck in the status of propertyless serfs. The big winners have been the expert class of the clerisy, and most of all, the tech oligarchs, who benefit as people rely more on algorithms than human relationships.
With this, around the world, the middle class is becoming more squeezed than ever, and it's having profound economic, social, and spiritual implications. Here on the show, we're having conversations with business, government, and citizen leaders like you to get to the core of these issues and explore how we can work together to form a better future than the one we're headed towards. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Feudal Future podcast. And we're delighted to have with us today two really eminent guests that are some of America's most esteemed scholars and commentators on urban life. Fred Siegel, who is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and one of the founding contributing editors of City Journal, which is preeminent journal on city life in the United States, is joining us. He's actually today, as we're recording this podcast, about to release his new book, which is Crisis of Liberalism, Prelude to Trump, which should be fascinating. Both he and his son Harry, who I'll introduce in a second, co-authored Prince of the City, which is a book in 2006, I believe, that was that looks at the rise of Rudy Giuliani and how he handled New York during the 9/11 crisis, and fascinating piece of work. Harry Siegel is, excuse me, is the senior editor at the Daily Beast, writes a weekly column for the New York Daily News that chronicles life in New York City, and is the host of an award-winning podcast called FAQ NYC. So gentlemen, welcome. We're delighted to have you.
Thanks for having us.
Well, I don't know if I'd be quite as glowing as Marshall, since I know you both better. But I think it's basically right. And, one of the things Marshall's from Poughkeepsie. My family's from Brooklyn, and then I grew up in Long Island. The condition of New York City is of particular concern. Where do you see the city now? What do you think its current trajectory is? Fred, Harry?
Well, I'll turn it over to Harry in a second, but just the one thing that struck me in the last few days is that the landlords, for want of a better term, the big time landlords in Manhattan have really had it with de Blasio, and they blasted him. And what they're asking him to do now is ride the subways, because unless he rides the subways, they don't think they can begin to fill up their office space. These are guys who own millions of square feet of Class A office space, and it's largely empty right now. And every effort they've made to bring people back from working online has failed. And I don't know where this goes in the future, except to suspect that a significant portion of the workforce will not come back at all. Wants to stay home, wants to work from home. And it might be, and you suggested this to me, Joel, though some of these people will come in one day a week, one day every other week. But most of the time they'll work from home. The other thing that's striking is, according to a recent survey, 30% of the people working at home are planning on moving. Not planning on quitting their jobs, but they're planning on moving out of the New York metropolitan area altogether because it's just too damn expensive.
So my dad may be omitting a couple of things here. These business leaders, not all of them in real estate, did write this open letter to the mayor. They did this after trying to deal with him privately. They actually held off on publishing the letter because, as Kathy Wild, who heads the sort of umbrella group that represents much of big business in New York, explained, they thought it would be unseemly if it came while they were still in the Hamptons prior to Labor Day. De Blasio, our mayor, is a disaster. He's unintelligent and unserious and causing significant problems. He does everything through message control, and he doesn't have that much control of the message. As we're recording on Thursday, we just had a second delay in when schools are reopening in this bizarre hybrid model where kids are in school some day, but remote learning others, which is the most classic example of a middle of the road is roadkill I've ever seen. A man who lacks the courage of his own and anyone else's convictions. But that said, no one is going back to Midtown, given present circumstances, who can help it.
Yeah,
that's not something de Blasio caused.
That brings up an interesting question, which is, cities kind of grew because of the network effect. The idea of people, the more people that have connections with each other, the more vibrant the city grows. Is there kind of like a threshold, you think, that below which the city really just becomes not a viable thing for the future?
I hope that's wrong, but for the immediate future, the recrudescence of Midtown is going to come very slowly, and de Blasio is not doing enough to encourage it. outdoor dining is fine. It's kind of fun. It's a one-time thing. Winter's coming. And then the key you have to remember is lunch. People in Midtown who work in Midtown used to work in Midtown, and the offices, the whole day was structured around lunch. Who did I meet? What club did I go to, et cetera, et cetera. Well, but if these restaurants are only allowed to have people, allowed to have 25% occupancy, what kind of vibrance is going to emerge out of that? It's hard to see, and masked people at 6 feet apart, in restaurants, only 25% capacity. Not much can come of that. So New York is going to face a long, slow haul.
If you can't have the density we've had for public health reasons, then there's a limited chance for that stretch of time of a full recovery. And that's a 25% capacity, or 50% for restaurants or whatever. I don't think the issue really is Cuomo saying New York's restaurants can only open at 25% capacity at the end of September, right when the weather's turning. I think the issue is people don't want to go to restaurants. They don't want to go to movie theaters. They sure as hell don't want to commute into offices in Midtown. I don't particularly like de Blasio. I have mixed feelings about Cuomo, but it's hard for me to put that on them. Those are sort of fundamental realities right now with how people are structuring their lives and what they're economically able to do. And in the course of that, you're having very weird real estate developments where suddenly lots of people are looking at second homes on much larger tethers than were the case before. They still maybe feel connected to New York for work or family or other reasons, but people with money and were able to work remotely, having a second place that maybe becomes a permanent place, maybe more quickly if the school year doesn't start, you're starting to see those trends accelerate. There's parts of this that are healthy. Our real estate market is badly overdue for a correction. And this includes both commercial and residential real estate and like prime Manhattan and outer borough stuff. I don't think that too many people are upset about that. I think we had a level of density in Midtown that was approaching inhuman and deeply unpleasant and nobody enjoyed. And there were some economic benefits for that, but they were largely going to, the people who own the buildings and the top of the market there. So maybe some good comes out of this. There are a lot of reasons to be pessimistic. Our political leadership stinks. Albany, which is now fully controlled by Democrats and is going to look more like California, like their conversation is still February, right? There is no $20 billion hole in the state budget. There's no giant hole in the city budget, the flows, some of which comes through the state. It's all just, hey, we're going to tax the rich more. De Blasio, his press secretary said, if the rich people want to leave, they can kick rocks. I think getting some of their taxes is good. And I'd also know that practically, it's a lot of middle-class people who have been leaving, who have had some option to, have had family members who can help with education while they're working remotely and other things. Anyone who says they know where we're going to be in a year or two is kidding themselves at this point, but it's a tremendous breath-holding moment like we have not had since maybe 2008 in the financial crash, or maybe 2001, when, 20 years later, this is almost forgotten. But there was the sense there are going to be more planes going into more buildings. There are going to be more terrible things happening. Is New York ever going to recover from this? And, as it turns out, the city did. This is a very different challenge this time. And I'm not confident that sort of the fundamentals that got us to this point are going to exist on the other end. And if they don't, it's a really open question what we are. And last thing here, we know that our political fundamentals are going to lag that by at least a couple of election cycles. So whatever urgent budget needs we have, whatever needs to get figured out, we have a new crew that's coming to power in Albany. And the governor is constraining to some extent, but that's limited. And that might go away if they get a veto-proof Democratic majority in the state Senate. That's like, we just need to tax more. We need more services and have no interest in the other half of that picture and have the sense that you can always take more from these employers, while at the same time saying if these employers want to leave, they can go to hell. And I'm not sure that's going to be a sustainable dynamic.
Yeah. One thing I would add to what you said, son, is that we have an election in less than 2 months. It's going to have a profound, the national election always has a profound effect on the New York mayoral election. The last disaster as a mayor, David Dinkins, was elected mayor because Jesse Jackson did so well in the 1988 Democratic Party primaries. So I don't know what's going to happen in this general election. I literally throw my hands up. I don't. The polls I think are not very useful at this point. I don't know that there's some alternative.
If Joe Biden wins, there's money for New York. Number one, the probably isn't there otherwise, and he helps bring the Senate blue or closer to it, and that would be a big deal. And some of that's overdue. Some of that money you can argue about. New York dug plenty of its own hole and prior to this, but it's now dealing with problems it did not create. That's number one. But number two is the election in 2021 is no longer necessarily a resistance footing. And I actually think there's a much better chance for somebody who says, hey, we need to correct some of these things. We need to deal with this distressing rise in shootings. We need to make sure we have a tax base, like for potentially a moderate Democrat sort, whether they're running as a Democrat in that primary, or they're trying to run outside of it in a city where generally the primary is the whole thing. I think we're much more likely to have a healthy and honest election here if everything isn't aligned around Trump and his totalizing of all local politics, which I think is generally destructive.
Your point, that's a really interesting point that you raise about what this will actually do for the tax base. As I call this the blight flight of New York. And you have what I think could be a significant increase in the power of the suburbs in the tri-state area. I know so many people that have moved either obviously from out of, say, Manhattan to Dutchess County or Ulster County, but people who are living in places like Essex County in New Jersey wanting to move out toward the Pennsylvania border, because A, it's less expensive, B, they're not going to come into their workplace, whether that's Manhattan, Newark, or Basking Ridge. They're not going to come into that on a regular basis. So why not live in the exurbs? What will that do for the tax base of the tri-state, the immediate New York metropolitan area?
New York faces an immediate problem, independent of the election, and that is the subways are $5 to $8 billion in debt, and there very few people want to ride them, and it's hard to see where the revenue is going to come from. The state is probably not going to be able to supply. It'll supply some of it. The subways are a state responsibility, and yes, the state legislature would like to tax more, and more often, as often as possible. But if you ever talk to some of the legislators up there, we're not dealing with the brightest bunch of people.
We know about that in California.
Politics is not something that seems to be attracting the best and brightest.
On the contrary, the upshot of that is assuming Cuomo was more competent than he is, and Harry and I disagree on this, not totally, but partly. Cuomo is mostly interested in posturing. And he has a book coming out. Cuomo has a book coming out in a few months.
How I Beat the Virus, the Andrew Cuomo story.
Pick up, Larry.
I want to go back to the Exodus for 1 second and just say a couple of real quick things. First off, that Manhattan Institute survey you mentioned about the New Yorkers thinking they'll leave in the next 2 years. By the way, the reason the vast majority of them say they're going to leave, I don't have the crosstabs in front of me, is because of the cost of living. That's like 70% of them have that as a factor. 30% say the virus. So just bear that in mind when you're thinking about the.
And by the way, Silicon Valley, Bay Area, same exact situation.
Yep. Secondly, the New York Times and the New York Post, for different reasons, which are very different papers, have both gotten incredibly overexcited about people fleeing New York stories. The Times, because respectfully, a lot of their editors don't live in the city, and when they're there, they're at Times Square. And they're sort of squinting and imagining it the rest of it from there. And because they have readers who often have a certain sort of suburban orientation. The Post, because even though they're in New York, they sort of hate New York some of the time. But in any case, there's not that many people leaving. This is actually a huge suburban story. You know, if you have like 15,000 new buyers in your market in like Nassau or Westchester, that's gigantic. If 15,000 people leave New York, that's like, Thursday. And that's fine. And there's 14,000 people coming. One other key thing here, though, is the schools. New York has had a public school system that, for its many flaws, has not been a system of last resort. If you go to Philadelphia, if you go to Detroit, if you go to lots of other cities, like the public schools are generally where people go if they don't have another option. And that other option is often paying for a private school, moving directly outside the city limits, or finding some other squeeze out. New York hasn't operated that way up until now. There's in fact been a tremendous pressure to make the elite high schools that they're not representative of the city because they're overwhelmingly Asian and then white in a city where most students are Black and Hispanic. Going forward, I'm worried that instead of having that very sort of privileged debate that you get to when you're in a good and healthy position, we're going to be in one where you have all these people who have gone to pods or have actually enrolled their kids in other school systems or otherwise withdrawn who are not going to be super excited about coming back. And I think that would be a fundamental change to the city if middle-class parents check out of those schools.
Explain what a pod is.
A pod in this case, as I think listeners with school-age kids will know, is when you're sort of aligning a group of kids and then they're meeting separately and there's like a teacher who's meeting with them as opposed to participating in the larger school system.
Right, and that pod may be 6 kids, 8 kids, something on that order of magnitude.
And
yeah.
Just to first of all, I mean the exodus from New York was going on way before COVID. So the question really is going to be, will it slow down? Who's leaving? But what I'm wondering about is how can we take this particular crisis and turn it into an opportunity? For instance, if we now know that the public school system really doesn't work, is there some alternative to it? If we know that having mass commuting into Manhattan, given social distancing, I don't see how you do it. I think, if you're having to reduce your office count to a half or a third of what it was, it doesn't pencil out at all. Are there opportunities for New York to reinvent itself as a more dispersed, with a more diverse kind of economy out of this crisis?
Good God, yes. You start off with having retail that's pleasant and appealing and actually has some relation to the people who are walking by in the street instead of being billboards for corporations. Hopefully, and I'm pessimistic here, you have a correction in residential real estate prices that allows people to buy, invest, and stay in the city. I say I'm pessimistic because my sense is we're going to get out of this phase of the virus with the people who have money in the bank, big capital dominant over everyone else, and that they're probably going to go on buying sprees and find ways to financialize houses and get further into that market. But if that doesn't happen and prices go down and it's a buying opportunity for actual New Yorkers or would-be New Yorkers to invest and like put down real roots here, I think that would be awesome. If Midtown ends up being a less dominant office presence, to some extent, I think that would be healthy. And, there've been many years of attempts to take parts of Queens, to take parts of downtown Brooklyn and make those into viable and dense, but less dense Class A office space areas. I'd like to see some of that happen. And maybe you end up with a more affordable and breathable city that continues to be like a real home for commerce and a place where the value that's created has a little more to do with the people who are here. That's very optimistic. With the schools, Joel, I think that's a little unfair. Like, this didn't show the failure of the public school system. It showed the idiocy of this mayor in a very direct way.
But let me argue with you a little bit about the office-based economy side. If you look at who isn't coming back into a workplace, it's more likely to be business and professional services people that work in offices. Is there a play to reinvent New York as a light manufacturing center or other kinds of jobs that would be applicable to middle-class people?
I would add to that the idea of artisanal. I mean, for instance, I think of Brooklyn, where you both are. Brooklyn has now a huge group of very talented, skilled people who still have had to go into Manhattan.
why can't there be a Brooklyn-based artisanal economy that may have more opportunities and also would obviate the need to go on the subway?
There's a
But
bunch
Joel,
of
there
by
already
the
is.
waterfront. There's like Industry City,
Right.
which is a big development that wants to get bigger. The local politician is sort of stopping that, who has an implicit veto over those things. We'll see if that holds. But broadly speaking, I think there's going to be a lot more opportunities for manufacturing and an economy that's physically connected to New York, and things, actual things, remember things that were produced there on the other end of this. I don't know if it's going to be enough to compensate, but that is the silver lining, we hope, in where things are at now.
Well, you know, Joel, you were talking about the out-migration. The rise of artisanal production in New York is also something that's occurred over the last 3 or 4 years. Maybe change that, 4 or 5 years. You've seen an increase in this kind of artisanal production, and I think that will succeed and will continue. But Harry talked about an industry city, which is the outstanding example of this. The problem with that is the underlying costs of operating in New York are still too high. The taxes are still far too high. The regulation is still far too extensive. New York would have to, if a new mayor, let's suppose, would have to reconsider how to reduce the taxes, how to reduce the regulation. We're never going to be a low tax, low regulation area, but we could be lower tax and less regulation. But if this continues at this rate, I think that the dispersal will continue, and not to good effect.
You know, Fred, you could substitute California for New York, and it's the identical situation. Both states are making themselves so unattractive to business. And I think the fundamental flaw in the thinking of politicians is they don't realize how mobile businesses are. You know, today you can pick up, you know, okay, I want to go set up in the Bahamas or whatever, you know, it's relatively easily done. And, and I think that most of the planners are overplaying their hand in terms of thinking that people must be in Silicon Valley or must be in New York for doing what they're doing.
Well, I think the big, when you mentioned 9/11, the big difference is, had there been an internet that functioned like it does now, the effect would have been much greater. There were fewer options. Now, companies, by the way, the financial industry did move out in considerable numbers, and to Florida and Dallas and places like that. But this is a whole new ball game. I mean, you now have people like we're seeing here in California, for instance, we're losing a lot of our radio talk show hosts who are moving to Tennessee or moving to Florida, who historically would have been here, because here in Southern California, you want to be able to have the celebrities, for instance, come in on your show. Well, now, since you're doing it over Zoom, it doesn't matter that you're there or not there. And so I think that this is a really major challenge. And what I find most disturbing is how few urbanists are thinking about, okay, how do we rethink about this? I did a piece for Harry where I touched on some of this in the Daily Beast. I mean, why can't why can't we just start thinking differently? I mean, in 1920, New York, Manhattan, being a New Yorker, we always talk about New York as actually being Manhattan. Manhattan had 2.4 million people. In 1950, it had 1.5 million. Maybe, as Harry was talking about, a Manhattan with 200,000-300,000 less people and half as many tourists might be a great place to live. And by the way, even more attractive to the very well-educated and the well-heeled, because I found in my most recent trips to New York, and I've been going obviously my whole life, is that it was becoming just almost dystopic, so crowded, so just fundamentally unpleasant, and increasingly uninteresting.
Right.
Large parts of Midtown Manhattan, are like walking through
Side
South Coast
havens.
Plaza,
Yeah, exactly.
without the good weather.
But Joel, your point about uninteresting, you got to add another element to this, and that is the local riots took out a lot of small business,
Right.
and it's small business that made New York interesting. You didn't know interesting, an unexpected small business shows up on West Broadway as you walk down the street. That's gone, but that's gone. Before the riots, there was the other element that was already bleeding these businesses is the cost of doing business in New York, and how to set up a restaurant, you had to adhere to the code for signs. The code for signs in and of itself is a quagmire. The sign's a little too large, there's a fine a little too small as a sign, the lettering is too small. New York, if it moves, New York will tax it. And with the case of the lettering, even if it doesn't move, but can move, and in the immediate sense, where Harry talks about what's happening in the legislature, I'm just filled with dread by that. From that, when the Republicans controlled the legislature, there was a check on what Democrats could do. The Democrats control the assembly, they control the governor's mansion. But now they control the whole show, and there's no sign, there's no indication that they're recognizing the consequences of their power.
Well, I just wondered maybe if we could, begin to say, if we, if we're just imagining for the next 5 or 10 years, is there any option to what we see in California as well, where you have, blue domination, incredibly large, disproportionate to the point that, for instance, when you talk to legislators or Congress people who are Democrats here, they say, I don't worry about the right. I don't worry about middle-class communities voting Republican or wanting a more conservative thing. I worry completely about the left. I mean, are we talking about a New York City that is basically its political patron saint is AOC?
Well, if you start with the idea that small businesses are fleeing now because of the riots, like certain Siegels on this call, who I won't mention, because I don't think that's entirely connected. I don't want to say anything good about people about people rioting, smashing windows, burning down businesses, and this really happened in the Bronx and in Midtown for the first time in many, many years, but over a very limited number of nights. And I don't think that this has been a phenomenon that's causing small businesses to leave. I think you just want to be careful about what perspective you're putting that in. Joel, I'm so sorry. I just lost my thread in the question. I was bringing that back to entirely.
And you're the youngest guy here. You don't have a right to do that.
Let me ask you this. Let me ask you both. So, Fred, you have built an entire life around market-oriented economics. The notion of using incentives instead of subsidies, is this, is this like so politically incorrect in New York that you would never be able to kind of return to a market-driven world? Or like, have we just gone past the tipping point?
We've gone past the tipping point, but we've gone past the tipping point before. When John Lindsay was the mayor, we went past John Lindsay. In a week of John Lindsay's mayoralty, the city lost 600,000 jobs. It's an astounding, from a smaller city, and there was no sense that the city could come back. Mayor Beam was de Blasio without the charm. and
Better accounting skills.
Barely. And slowly, Koch began to dig us out of the hole we were in. But I don't see a Koch there. I don't know. There's the demography of this. We haven't talked about immigration. The demography of the city is such, I don't see the basis for a revival.
This is where I was going to go before, just very quickly. There are these self-correcting parts within the Democratic Party that means not everything is decided just in party terms, just in these primaries, although more and more of it is. The reason Republicans kept control one half of the legislature, you know, we have two houses in the legislature here for so long, when they're a minority, a clear minority in the state, because New York City is so dominant, is because these Democrats shifted and joined them because they got power, they got some money, and they agreed to hold certain other lines. That arrangement lasted for nearly a decade. And you're at a point now where if things push too far to the left, you have these Long Island Democrats are going to have to flee, or they're going to get primaried and knocked out. Within the city, you have some similar dynamics. So I don't think it's just everything goes farther and farther in that direction. And I'm not sure that's the case in New York City itself either. I think that may be the case with the city council, which is fairly weak, but I'm not sure that dynamic is going to play out in a mayoral race, and particularly after you know, what will be 8 years of a fairly unsuccessful and fairly unpopular liberal mayor. I'm not sure we just go farther in that direction, and especially if Trump is not in the White House, and consequently, we can actually talk about some of the local issues here.
On the contrary, son, if Biden is the president, it will be all subsidy talk all the time. That's the only thing that will be discussed. How much can we get out of Washington? And there will be no talk about restructuring or reimagining.
There's no money. It's possible that that'll be the case in the election, and people are going to tilt that way and say Washington's going to help fix these things. I think that's very hard to do as a candidate. Whatever money we get out of Congress, right, with Biden pushing for it, with Democrats running the Senate, is not going to fill the holes we have now, and it's certainly not going to fill the ones we're going to have over the next few years. So I think anyone vaguely responsible who's running, I think we have a number of people who are that, you know, want to win above all else. They're politicians, but also want to win and then succeed. They're going to take some care. I don't think we're going to have a bidding war. I think plainly, you know, the city can't afford the size of the government it has now. And so this long run of good years, largely driven by Wall Street and endlessly, you know, expanding tax base, no matter what happens and no matter how many people in the middle leave, that's done.
Wall Street, yes. Crime reduction, yes, also there. Because when crime was reduced, property values increased. People wanted to live in different, anyway. The other striking thing is Wall Street's doing just fine. Not for good reasons, by the way, but leave that aside. Crime, which you're downplaying, as a much better, among the people I've talked to and can't say I've surveyed, but a wide range of people I've talked to, crime plays a major role. Why do I want to be in New York if I have to put up with this level of crime? And not just violent crime, petty street crime, petty kind of harassment that drives people crazy. Aggressive panhandlers. We've been through this cycle many times before. So I would put myself in this position. I have no idea what's coming. I have no idea what's going to happen in the election. I have no idea if my grandchildren are going to be back in school. I really don't know much of anything, except, and I have to say this, Joel, and you'll shoot me, except that my granddaughter, my granddaughter knows more than Harry and I do when it comes to planetary motions.
Well, maybe she should go work for Elon Musk. But just to conclude, what I'd like to ask you each is, if you wanted to bring back New York, what 3 priorities would you point to? 3 things that need to be done to bring New York back? Because even though I've been in California now for over 50 years, you know, I'm still a New Yorker. My family's from there. It's been part of our family history. What 3 things do you think should be done to begin reinventing and improving New York after these crises?
Harry, you want to go first, then?
Sure. Cost of living, quality of life, and quality of the school system, which I'm going to use in some ways actually just as a proxy for infrastructure more generally. Like I think those are the things you have to, the schools, and that includes CUNY, by the way, are the one place where when you're having it tighten up elsewhere, you need to put money into. If you have some sense that this isn't just a global city for the world elite and their money, and that you're investing in the people who are here, you have to put dollars there. At the same time, there have to be some controls on the cost of living so that you have some class that is not either very well off and sort of subsidizing services, or is receiving those services, or the people who are providing them, on behalf of the city. And quality of life, I think my dad can be a Manichaean and wildly over the top on this stuff, but there's no doubt that if people don't feel safe going outside, are uncomfortable in their neighborhoods, there's too many crazy raving people on every block. Sure, like ambitious and horny 20-year-olds are always going to come here, but you can't build a whole city on that, and you wouldn't want to.
Fred?
I want to mention something that we haven't discussed before: sanitation. The garbage collection in New York has been semi-halted. Let's just say restrained. Collection has been restrained. I'm using the term from the sanitation spokesperson. You can't do that. The city is as it's in the warm months. The failure of sanitation is palpable. Let's just say. The other thing is regarding the quality of life. You have to come to grips with the mentally ill homeless. We've done this before, and we succeeded. And this is part of what broken windows policing was about. We have to relearn why broken windows policing succeeded. Now it's not just here. I was much of the country in a deranged response to the murder of George Floyd. Which, by the way, may not have been a murder, and we'll find out when the trial comes in a few months. But in any case, the absence of broken windows policing is disastrous. In Minneapolis, the city council wanted to abolish the police. Now they're talking about the absence of police. They want more policing. We haven't gotten to that here, in part because the wealthier parts of the city are doing just fine. They're hiring private police, and they're Joel's talk about feudalism applies here. It's kind of a financial hierarchy, and people who work in financial services are going to do well, even though plenty have fled. Anyway, let me stop there and say that my son is not Manichaean, but is just someone lacks a feel for how the city has changed.
Well, this is a great story in the making, right? We'll see whether or not we default to more feudal forms of life, or whether people can kind of get their collective will together and reinvent civic structures so that it actually works more broadly for everybody. But we want to thank you so much, Fred and Harry, for sharing your thoughts and for being guests of ours on the Feudal Future podcast. We wish you all the best.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Thanks.